Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast at the MIT Center for Real Estate. Robbie Mulcahy here again. I'm a first-year student in the Master of Science in Real Estate Development program here at MIT. On the pod today, we have Kabir Seth of Presidio Bay Ventures. Very briefly, Presidio Bay, headquartered in San Francisco, designs, constructs, and operates commercial real estate for private and public center tenants across the U.S. and has a portfolio totaling 5.8 million square feet of new construction and adaptive reuse valued at nearly $5.4 billion. The firm specializes in both new construction and major renovation of mid to large-scale office, life science, and R&D spaces, mixed-use, urban infill, multifamily communities, industrial distribution centers, and other special-use facilities. In addition, Presidio Bay's expertise includes advisory work, asset management services, and strategic venture investment in early-stage commercial real estate technology companies. The firm's philosophy is founded in the notion of hospitable thinking, which seeks to transform physical locations into coveted destinations where people are eager to congregate, connect, collaborate, and create. Suffice it to say, we're really excited to have you on the podcast today, Kabir, and we've got a lot to talk about. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, as you might have noticed, I prefer not to give really lengthy introductions about our guests themselves because I prefer to, have you explain your background in your own words. You have an incredibly interesting and varied and impressive career. Would love if you could start from the beginning. Tell us a bit about how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'll go all the way back. I was fun fact about me. I was born and raised in Dubai in the late '80s, and when you hear that, you might think, well, obviously that's why you're in real estate. But actually, that wasn't really on my radar until much later. So grew up there, did my schooling there till I was 18, and sort of parents said, you have a one-way ticket to college, and it's not going to be here. So basically, went to sort of the best place I could get into as far away from home, just because I had an itch to travel and adventure. And so ultimately ended up on the West Coast in the US and at UC Berkeley, did my undergrad there and graduated in 2010. And to be honest, didn't really have a great, solid sense of what I wanted to do. Obviously was focused on school and was interested in math, interested in economics, and, sort of coming out of the Great Recession. And really was just fortunate to be at that place at that time where, if it was 2 years earlier, I think life would have been very different. It just so happened that in 2010, things were starting to wake back up again. Firms were hiring and, just kind of followed the crowd a little bit to San Francisco and entered, investment banking without really knowing too much about what it was. But it was a really exciting time to just be involved in that ecosystem. Just tech companies were really sort of having their moment following the first sort of wave, 10, 12 years prior. And the amount of capital that was going towards companies in the gaming space, digital media, clean tech, and so on was just, there was this so much entrepreneurship and amazing ideas coming to life every day. And I was sort of like on ground zero, sort of helping raise capital for a lot of these early stage companies. But by the same token, I also saw that these companies are really, really good. There's so much investment activity in the area that ultimately you could see that the really, really good companies were just going to make it on their own, right? And so sort of my role in terms of raising capital, I could see maybe not being as required, I should say, in the future. But more importantly, I also just started having this itch to do something more entrepreneurial. I didn't quite know what it was, to be honest. I just knew that, it was a great experience starting my career in finance, and highly recommend that to honestly just about anybody who's young and doesn't really know what they want to do. It was a great training ground, got to make some great friends, a lot of whom I'm still very, very close to today, almost, whatever it is, 14, 15 years later. And so I was fortunate enough to, after a few years, meet my now business partner, Cyrus Sanandaji, who really founded the firm, but he and I got it off the ground in 2013 or so, and been on that journey ever since. So
it's awesome. It's very cool. I couldn't agree more about starting in finance. I think especially, it seems to me like, especially in the world of commercial real estate, right? There's folks who come up on the finance side, and then there's folks who come up on the construction side.
Right.
Or even like a third way is, right, folks who come up on the architecture side. And I just think having that strong foundation in finance is really key, especially being here at the MIT Center for Real Estate. I find that the folks who come here with a finance background just have a bit of a leg up, I think, in understanding. I mean, at the base of it, right, real estate developers are users of capital, right? We're investing other folks' money. So having that foundation in finance is really important.
Yeah, but I think also more than that, I think there's I think there's a psychological intimidation with the finance side of it versus like the design and construction side of it. And by that, I mean, like when you've got that early foundation, like I did, or perhaps you did and others do, it sort of becomes less scary, like the number side of things, because everybody, there's a lot of zeros, there's a lot of decimal places and interest rates and all these fancy terms that can sort of psych people out. But by the same token, I think we're all as humans, we're generally creative beings. And so when you come from the finance side and then are exposed to the design and construction and creative side, I feel like that's an easier transition for most than kind of going the other way around. Just psychologically, I think that might be a big part of it as well.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Now, would love to hear a bit more about Presidio Bay specifically for the folks who might not be as familiar on the podcast. Personally, I'm from the DC area. I've done most of my schooling in New England. I did not know much about Presidio Bay, but as I've done my research, I mean, I love the stuff that you guys are doing. I think it's cool, it's beautiful, it's thoughtful, and you guys have such an interesting background from where you started to where you are today. If you could walk us through like the genesis story, which you kind of started in meeting with Cyrus, but how did you guys start? What was the products that you were working on? How has that morphed into what Presidio Bay Ventures is today?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I'll add a little detail. So Cyrus and I actually know each other from back in Dubai. He also grew up there as well. He's a few years older, but he and I have actually known each other since, I was 13 and maybe he was like 15, 16. And then kind of sort of separately made our way to the US and the West Coast eventually. His journey with the real estate world, obviously had early days in college, but really it was a plane ride, if I'm getting the details right, from Switzerland, where he met essentially like the director of real estate for the FBI on a plane, and got to talking. And he ended up working for the General Services Administration, which, as we all know today, is slightly under attack by the current administration. But Cyrus spent a number of years as a contracting officer, essentially procuring real estate for the federal government. All the agencies you can think of: Social Security, FBI, DEA, CIS, USGS, really whatever agency needs a real estate footprint, the GSA is responsible for procuring that, going out to the public market, the private sector, but with public bids, and seeing what they can find. And after a few years, sort of decided that, hey, look, he was based in San Francisco. Let's use that sort of knowledge and relationships to start developing for the government instead of being on the government side. And that was really Presidio Bay sort of 1.0. And that's what initially attracted me. Again, as I mentioned, I was looking for something more entrepreneurial. And I said, hey, what better way to, do that? Even though I didn't really have exposure to real estate, I felt like I could figure out. It checked a lot of boxes, like I said, on the creative side: design, construction, finance, community, politics. And the fact that we were working with the federal government was obviously very exciting. And so we spent a number of years, developing, I think over a dozen assets, really, as far west as Guam, as far east as Louisiana. I always make the joke that if you've seen the movie War Dogs, where Jonah Hill and I forget who's his co-star, they go on that government website and they're, clicking links to bid on ammunition. We were on the same website, just real estate and not
That's
ammunition.
Good. That's good.
And again, so this was this is 2013, really through 2016. But by the same token, while it was definitely a very, I would say it's a very logical, it's a very, very niche sort of thesis that we were executing on. And obviously we had the relationships, we had the background to execute on that. We also did see the writing on the wall. Again, sort of post GFC, the government was very active in terms of real estate procurement. As time went on, the procurement period got a little bit longer and longer and longer. And so, we're sitting here in San Francisco, like I said, ground zero for all the demand that was coming out from all the capital that was being invested in new companies, all the folks that were moving in from different cities around the country to be here, be part of the action. So whether that was demand for new office space, demand for new residential space, retail, just people coming here and really driving up values, we said, you know what, like, we'd be silly not to actually play a part in the private sector development side of things. And again, it seemed like maybe a bit of a leap, but again, when you think about the notion of real estate development just really being a combination of relationships, capital, political involvement, community, and obviously, good design and good execution, like, it was a natural pivot for us to start exploring opportunities within the, value add or ground up office space or ground up residential space, high density multifamily, really, urban infill development. And it was, I'd say it was a good thing that we were really young, because there was a lot of, we didn't know what we didn't know. And that allowed us to sort of like just dive into things that I think if we were to do it again, we might have said, life's too short. We spend a lot of time, making mistakes, but also learning and doing a lot of things right, quite frankly, because we weren't scared, or didn't have any sort of preconceived notions about how things ought to be done or how long things ought to take and so on. And so I think when you mix that with the sort of generally entrepreneurial friendly nature of the Bay Area, where folks and particularly investors are willing to take a risk and take a leap of faith on young people in just about any sort of industry. I always say that, this is probably one of the one or two, maybe three places in the world where two guys, immigrants, could start a real estate development company in a city as big and as prominent as San Francisco and make it work with just, the right combination of luck and hard work.
Yeah, it's funny. I was in San Francisco in, I think it was 2015. I was studying under Tim Draper, actually. I was
Yeah.
part of like an accelerator program. And it was that time when it was just everybody seemed like they were excited about something. Everybody was, everybody had their startup outside of work that they were working on. And it was just a
Yeah.
really cool and exciting time to be in the Bay Area. I love those founder stories about making all the mistakes that you wouldn't make now. And I mean, I think that's like the beauty of young entrepreneurship is maybe, like the ignorance is bliss type.
Yes,
mentality.
definitely.
Right. Maybe this is a good segue into talking about the San Francisco market in particular, which I had wanted to bring up. So I know, a large part of your portfolio, if not all of your portfolio today, is in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd love to get your take generally on the market there. Of course, if someone were to pick up a newspaper and read only the headlines for the past 24 months, they would think that San Francisco is not
Armageddon. Yeah.
exactly. It's been a very bleak narrative with the doom loop, with sky high vacancy rates. And it seems like what you all are doing is building office in San Francisco, right? Which is like perhaps one of the more challenged asset classes in what seems to be, or at least what the narrative is one of the most challenged geographies in America. I'd love for you to walk us through why is Presidio Bay Ventures doubling down on San Francisco as a market, and why are you operating in the verticals that you're operating in there?
Yeah, absolutely. No, look, I think there was a point in time post, onset of the pandemic. And then I don't know if you recall, but it was sort of like a series of really, really bad headlines and news, whether it was like the sky turning orange when there were the fires happening, up north. And then you had like, I don't know, what was it, killer wasps or something. There was just this like 6 to 8 month period where, like, listen, we felt just as bleak and doom and gloomy as the rest of the world did about San Francisco for a much longer time though than we ended up doing. I think, like I said, there was an initial 6 to whatever month period where it was like, yeah, well, this is a real wake up call, because we just spent 10 years plus whatever it was on the up and up, right, in terms of growth, in terms of valuations, and folks sort of wealth generally going up, whether you were involved in the tech sector or just adjacent to it. It was just kind of like a low interest rate party, right? And then I think, but very quickly, folks who have decided in their hearts that San Francisco is their home, like I have, like Cyrus has, and many others obviously involved in real estate, just given the nature of the business. The obvious factors as to what makes San Francisco and the Bay Area resilient and has made it resilient over many cycles continue to be true, right? And I just want to caveat it by saying, like, it's silly to think that will always be the case. And I think that was part of like the hubris that at the local level got us to a lot of the challenges that made its way to the headlines, in the sense of killing the golden goose, right? Taking for granted the fact that we live in one of the most beautiful geographies. We have proximity to 3+ world class, I mean, literally world class institutions, educationally wise, and then many, many more around it at the higher education level that form this ecosystem. And that's just at the undergraduate level. Now, then you get it to the graduate level in terms of medicine, in terms of engineering, even finance, law. It's all here, right? And so that incredible depth of talent combined with how fortunate we are that this was where in the 70s Silicon Valley really took off, and that sort of inertia that comes with entrepreneurship, with value creation, with capital, and that sort of cycle of reinvestment that keeps happening. And when you finally layer on like the politics, at least in general, not to get too specific, but generally being a little bit more open to folks to come in to sort of live the American dream, all those things were like in this very, very geographically constrained spot of San Francisco. And we forget about the Bay Area, but San Francisco, everybody always says it's 7 by 7. Of that 7 by 7, maybe 3 by 3 is actually truly buildable because the rest is very hilly. It's parks, it's coastline, it's whatever. And so you're looking at that and you're going like, well, sure, things suck now, but surely, if enough people believe in, good times are just around the corner, if we just sort of like stick at it and stick together, this has to be the place that ultimately recovers. And now, nobody can sit here and say, well, I knew AI was coming around the corner and, that's why we stuck around. But AI, I think, and how prevalent it is, just as one sort of use case, I think it's unfair to all the other brilliant people and ideas and minds and companies that have been created. But let's just use AI because it's so prominent. It was almost inevitable that it did happen here because of all the factors that I just explained, right? The capital, the education, the people, the proximity, and the idea generation and sharing. And so whether it was AI or whether it was something else in the future, whatever it may have been, that sort of, I think, expectation was sort of deep in our minds, that ultimately this would be a place you want to continue to stay long, continue to, deepen our roots. It was quite frankly an opportunity for us to also, as you think about it sort of generationally, like we started the business at a really interesting time. I always joke that we started it like 2 years too late, right? In terms of value creation and being really at the vanguard of that last cycle. But now having been through this cycle and been part of the core group that stayed, that has really championed kind of the return of San Francisco, that's been very involved at the local level in terms of politics, in terms of community, probably seen a lot of, Cyrus has been very vocal about what ought to happen and needs to happen from like a common sense policy standpoint. We've really leaned into that aspect of things. And what that's allowed us to do is just really entrench ourselves in the opportunities that do exist. So now going back to answer your question, what are the verticals we're involved in? We're still sticking to what we have known best, which has generally been on the 3 buckets of commercial office, high density multifamily, mixed use. I would add life science to that as well, but the life science is mostly outside of San Francisco in the peninsula. We do have one asset in San Francisco, but really, applying our like design philosophy and our execution philosophy to what we think is ultimately sort of relatively irreplaceable real estate. And so, and right now in this moment of time, also recognizing that even the development community took for granted how much demand and how sort of, I don't want to say easy, but you can build something over the last 10 years and you kind of had this like expectation that it would lease up. Now, obviously, with the impacts of COVID, with the headline risk that people have, and sort of even convincing people within California that San Francisco is a good place to come back to, we're super excited because we've always been sort of felt like constrained in terms of what we wanted to do from a design and operational standpoint, because capital partners didn't really get it. They're like, well, why do you need to invest so much in, design or placemaking aspect of things? Like just build an office building and Facebook will come and lease it up. Well, that doesn't exist anymore, right? So now you've actually got to differentiate yourself as a developer. And it's, for us, a very exciting time because that's what we've really spent the last decade kind of building towards.
I mean, for what it's worth, I love San Francisco. I think it's such a great city. And I think, other than it being a beautiful place to live, I think there are so many factors that make it an excellent, investment thesis, right? It's supply constrained. There is demand, right? You've got incredible, network and agglomeration effects of, like you were talking about. I don't think it's like nobody could have seen AI coming, right? Like you said.
Right.
But at the same time, I think if there was any place that was poised to have, something like that geographically, it was San Francisco, right? Or the Bay Area. There are a few other places in America where that I think is possible. And I think it's vindicating for San Francisco, right?
And I think just our biggest challenge right now is making sure that as cycles inevitably happen, we benefit from it again. Yeah, lesson to learn, and let's not take it for granted. And hopefully, memories are longer than what they were before. But I think there's definitely that perception of, hopefully, we did take a lot of things for granted in terms of the regulations, in terms of the sort of relatively like anti-business approaches that were taken, and now we're sort of retrenching back to the center, which is a nice thing to see.
Yeah, it's great. And at least from the data, I've been, pulling recent metrics in preparation for this podcast discussion, and it seems like demand is coming back. I'm looking at a CBRE chart that's showing that in 2024, office demand was the highest it's been since 2019, still considerably lower, but
Hmm.
there's a very marked upward trend from 2022 to 2023 to 2024, right? We see office demand coming back. I was listening to the Weekly Take CBRE's podcast just this week, actually. They did a profile on San Francisco, and they're talking about how office vacancy for the first time in the fourth quarter of 2024, it did not increase for the first time since Q1 2020.
Yeah. Which
And
one you're at 30, 35% is
sure, right. Yeah, yeah,
maybe not saying much, but it's still a
yeah,
nice thing to hang your hat on
it's true. You
for
have some
now.
base effects there, right? No,
Yeah,
but it's great.
exactly.
I mean, it seems like the data is trending in the right direction, and
Right.
it's really great to see.
Definitely.
So I guess moving from San Francisco more broadly, geography to Presidio Bay Ventures and specifically what you guys are doing there. So
Hmm.
I would love to talk about specifically what you guys are building. And there's one vertical that you guys are involved in that I think is really interesting which is office, and specifically
Hmm.
this thesis you have around office resort. Could you tell us more about that thesis and how you're executing on it?
Yeah. Look, I think it's sort of in the name, right? That's why we chanced upon it. That's why we've written about it and are using that as kind of like a very sort of like easy mnemonic for people to wrap their heads around what we're trying to accomplish here. And the basic concept is, let's give people a reason to be in the office. Let's make their experience from the moment they walk in the door to the moment they leave the office, as pleasant, as, I don't want to say relaxing or luxurious, but just in no other words other than pleasing, like aesthetically, emotionally. How can you bring a lot of those elements that you normally associate with, high-end hospitality executions, and now to an extent you've seen it on the residential space. Now let's introduce it in maybe like one of the fewer sort of remaining contexts in which it hasn't been really fully applied, which is the office environment, right? Let's move away from this notion of luxury and lifestyle and amenities are only reserved for the C-suite and the top technology companies, but let's actually make it something that is accessible and can be experienced by just about anybody, right? Regardless of which sort of industry you're in or what position you are, sort of across whichever geographies that where it makes most sense to apply it, because it does come today obviously with additional capital investment both on the design and construction and also on the operational side. But our hope is that as this becomes more and more desired, just like the level and the bar of what we consider the office space will continue to rise.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. I love the idea of applying, hospitality, like you said, to one of the few places where it hasn't been applied before. And I think
Mhm.
it's incredibly relevant today in, this RTO world that we're living in. Like
Yeah.
how do you incentivize people to want to leave their homes, their work from home lifestyles that they've become accustomed to? And you have to make the workplace a place that they really want to go to, right?
Well, and the reason for that is like we're also, and again, I'm always very conscious of, we are somewhat in a bubble in the Bay Area. So when I say things like folks are generally more aware of, their health, physical, mental health, folks are generally more attuned now, particularly post pandemic, to the value of like community, actually being like physically in touch with people and actually having not reasons, but the actually sort of differently, actually having opportunities to create those relationships in meaningful ways. And then you think about how folks think about productivity, like we're sort of carrying these phones around with us all the time. Like we can sort of have this sort of work from anywhere approach. But then how do you combine that work from anywhere? Like I don't want to be chained to my desk mentality with the fact that I want community, the fact that I want when I'm at work to have ways to improve my physical, mental health. All those things are also components of the sort of office resort sort of thesis. Because again, when you go to a hotel, like what do you generally see? You see large, expansive spaces. You see gyms. You see spas, and you see friendly people who make you feel at ease. You sort of have chance encounters with other guests. You develop friendships in a very organic way, and so a lot of that comes with how we sort of let our guards down in a positive way when we're sort of on holiday or in a hotel for that matter. And so how do we sort of bring that to a professional and work context, maintain the professionalism, but sort of attain better productivity outcomes because people are just feel better about where they are. And when they compare it to their living room or their kitchen or whatever it may be, folks start to see that it's just a superior sort of outcome, even if it's partial, even if it's not full 5 days a week, it's still a reason to actually avail yourself of the office.
Sure. No, I love it. I think it's great. And I think you talk about the Bay Area bubble and maybe those things are important to folks there, but I do think all the things you just talked about are
Yeah.
they're secular trends, right? Like I
Yeah.
think the world is moving in that direction and you guys are at the vanguard, which I think is very, very cool. Would love to hear. So you have this Springline project, which my understanding is kind of the first iteration or your first foray
Yeah.
into this resort office resort. Could you tell us about that project, the genesis? I mean, I would love to hear the soup to nuts story, if
Yeah.
if you want to go through that.
Yeah. I mean, look, truly soup to nuts, that project started in, I want to say 2013, 2014, when the land was starting to be assembled. We were brought into the project in 2020, sort of right when the world shut down. And the capital partner sort of behind the project recognized that, it's a massive project. It's for, especially for Menlo Park standards, 6.5 acres, about 250,000 feet of office, 183 residential units, almost 25,000, almost 30,000 feet of retail, really over almost a thousand space parking garage. And so that's a lot to sort of wrap your head around and build and execute on. And you just had this, big, massive global pandemic hit. And, the notion of a Robinhood or a Facebook or, well, I guess Meta now, or Google coming in and leasing up all the office space and saving the day was sort of out the window, right? And, to the capital partners' credit, they recognized that and brought us in. We met with them and had a number of conversations about what our vision for this project would be. We kind of saw this as a truly once in a generation development opportunity to bring in a lot of concepts that we've touched on in this conversation, but others that we haven't, into not just Menlo Park but the Bay Area, and really sort of like raise the bar in terms of what's possible, particularly in a mixed use context. And so at that time, we put the project on hold. It was sort of mid construction. The basement, the 2-level basement garage had been built, but other than that, it was you know steel bars and sticks sort of coming out of the ground. And we completely redesigned the project as much as we could, everything from structural elements down to door selections, tile selections in the residential units, how we laid out the retail merchandising plan, really curating it to be kind of a food and beverage destination. After evaluating other options of what it could be, we sort of recognized that, look, despite it being Menlo Park, you've got some of the highest income per capita in the country, if not the world. Yet you could probably name maybe 2 or 3 restaurants that you would go to on a Friday night, and like that was insane to us, right? And so it's not to say that we wanted to put in like 3 Michelin star restaurants the entire way through. We're like, no, let's just actually curate a food destination that caters to everything from the grab and go to the fine dining, everything from casual Californian to Italian to omakase to Burmese to breweries and everything in between. And we had the opportunity to do that, just given the amount of space that we were dealing with. And interestingly, notions like how we were curating the retail and how we were thinking about like the common open space is really kind of what ultimately dictated a lot of how we executed on the rest of the project, which was again to foster this like amazing sense of place, this amazing destination, actually create a new sort of nexus of office, nexus of residential, and nexus of retail, and also nexus of community within Menlo Park, where none had really existed, at least in a new format for many decades. Its location right next to the Caltrain station was obviously beneficial. I think yes, there's definitely merit to the transit oriented piece of it, but I would say beyond that, it is drawing folks with all modes of transportation just because of what it has to offer now as a destination within Menlo Park.
It's really cool. I mean, for what it's worth as well, there's a podcast, right? This thing is beautiful. I would absolutely encourage anyone listening to this pod to look it up because it's a gorgeous and
Thank you.
really well designed project. And I think it shines through. I love, your talk about how detail oriented you guys are about design down to the handles and curating a tenant mix, which I think is
Yeah.
so important as well. You're probably familiar with Strip Mall Guy. We
Yeah.
just had him here. Yeah, we just had him
Nice.
here as a guest. And I mean, one of his biggest things is like success is a lot about how you curate tenants.
Yeah.
And like you said, I mean, maybe 3 Michelin star restaurants would be cool, but is that exactly what you want or what your potential users of the space are going to want?
Yeah, and beyond that, there's like, we don't have a typical landlord tenant relationship at Springline, particularly with the retailers and the restaurateurs. And yes, part of that was due to the pandemic, where it was very tough for operators, restaurateurs to raise capital in that environment. And so, if you wanted to get tenants as a landlord, you had to sort of reach a little deeper and offer them the build out space. And for us, that created an opportunity to actually enter into a more sort of real partnership with our tenants, and to the point where we met with each of the operators individually, sort of got a sense of like what they were looking to accomplish, what their dreams and vision were, what our dreams and visions were, how they could all mix. And now to this day, just as an example, like not only are we obviously on first names basis with all the operators, but more importantly, they're on first names basis with each other, and it's very unusual to have operators, especially at their caliber, collaborating as deeply as they do, not just for their own benefit, like lessons learned, obviously, and how do we coordinate like deliveries and da da da, da, but also like how do we create a better experience for the residents, for the office tenants, because they're going to be the ones that then spread the word of mouth and bring more people to the community. And it's just a really, really cool thing to see. So now that when we host like events at Springline within the plaza, like, our operators are the first ones there providing the catering, providing logistical support. And it's just a really, really cool ecosystem that's been able to be developed.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sure that's a testament to great design, that sort of collaboration. Well, that's cool. So it seems like the next project, maybe in this vein, is 88 Spear. Would love if you could tell us a bit more about that, where you guys are in the development process with that project and what the vision
Yeah.
is, maybe what some learnings were from Springline that you're implementing into 88 Spear.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we don't have 6.5 acres to work with in San Francisco. We have a 12-story office building, but it was interestingly enough, like despite their sort of physical differences, it was a really cool opportunity, I think, to translate a lot of what had been done at scale at Springline and distill it down to its core principles in a much smaller, condensed format within downtown San Francisco. Just starting with the fact that, look, I think we were the first deal to close sort of post the reset when interest rates, started going up and buildings were sort of going back left and right. And so, we closed with this in August of 23, I want to say. For us, it was first and foremost a bet on San Francisco's recovery. Second, a bet on the fact that we're sort of in this now very early stages of a complete sort of like a mindset shift in what tenants want in an office space. And yes, partly that's due to tenants are kind of in the driver's seat, just given how much supply is there. But truly, I think it's a reflection of we now really need to address the changes of tastes within decision makers at commercial tenants, because the folks that were perhaps my age or slightly older are now the decision makers, right? They're sort of in their sort of mid stage of their career, whether they're now becoming partners at venture firms, whether they're now sort of like mid to senior level folks at companies within San Francisco. They're the ones now sort of like driving decisions around culture, where to be, and what to experience, right? And they don't want the same old, particularly when you're trying to bring folks back to the office. And so the Spear was a vacant building. We bought it. When we bought it, it was roughly 70% occupied, but very quickly it was heading towards effectively, zero occupancy. And we obviously knew that. And that played well to our thesis, because we knew we were going to invest a significant amount of capital to achieve everything we wanted to achieve, translating Springline's approach from a design standpoint, from a hospitality standpoint, from an amenitization standpoint, and just overall experience. And so that would mean that, we really needed like a blank canvas with no interruptions to work with. And we needed it to be of a manageable enough size. Like this would have been very difficult to do if the building was twice the size at 300,000 feet or whatever it was. Like as it happened, it was enough that with the capital that we have, we were able to sort of acquire it without putting on any debt. It was any lender would have laughed us out of the room if we showed them our business plan, particularly at that point in time. So it really took that entrepreneurial Bay Area sort of mindset to say, look, let's do something daring. Let's do something that nobody is in their right mind thinking of doing right now. Yes, we're buying the building for cheap, but then we're also going to be spending a significant amount of capital. And you're going to end up in a situation where you're like, it's as far opposite as you can be from the let's just buy low and ride the wave back up. This is let's buy low and let's create the wave pool like as we're building it, and then we'll be the ones surfing it hopefully when all is said and done. And so even though we have a constrained footprint, we're able to pack in a lot more from an experience standpoint than has been previously available. So full basement sort of amenitization plan that's going to be catered towards both the community and productivity aspect of things, with meeting rooms, with sort of very flexible gathering areas that can go from, a small sort of like TED Talk style event to a multi-hundred person, sort of sit down dinner banquet style event. It'll also have our gym, our spa, our sort of wellness offerings there, sort of at the basement level. And then when you get up to like the ground floor, that's sort of the more like open to the public as well. As where we're going to be building in, partnering with one of our higher end co-working operators, but have it be sort of like a free flowing lobby with a very well known, and we're very excited about F&B tenant that we're bringing in that's going to really draw people in off the street. It's all going to be where people in the building can come down. So kind of bringing this sort of, if you've ever been to One Vanderbilt or, Penn One in New York, where it's just, very free flowing and it's just a lot of energy, a lot of buzz at the ground floor, that New York does really, really well. And San Francisco has historically not done very well at all. And we want to bring a little bit of that, again, being very cognizant that it's at a much smaller scale than what they're doing in New York. But we hope it's a taste that will be sort of well perceived by people, both at the tenant and consumer standpoint. And then finally, at the rooftop, we wanted to take the opportunity of the fact that we have effectively uninterrupted views of the bay. So we're going to be adding effectively 2 levels, including a rooftop event space and what may ultimately be a restaurant bar as well, sort of in tandem with that. So we're very excited about that. Again, that it's also hilarious. I've also thought, like, again, coming from Dubai, where sort of like the nightlife and entertainment is a very big part of the culture. And you come to a place like San Francisco, and when they come up with the list of the top 10 rooftop bars in San Francisco, like number 3 on the list is a 2-story converted home in the Richmond where I live, or the Sunset, I should say.
Very trendy. Yeah.
And you're like, seriously? So, the fact that we have this opportunity to do that, and again, I think kind of really lean into our desire to bring really cool experiences to San Francisco in a really tasteful way, in a way that you normally experience in other cities, but don't really get to experience here for a variety of reasons. I think cultural, San Francisco is not a very flashy city, and we're not saying we're going to be flashy at all. It's quite frankly the opposite. Like, our whole approach is just like tasteful elegance. Like, you just walk in and you're like, this is nice, as opposed to it being in your face with like gold and marble columns and, loud music. Like, it has to be done right. It has to be done with the right operators, with the right design, and the right sort of, seamless integration with the rest of the building as well. The experience when you walk in the lobby through the top floor has to be consistent. They can't be sort of viewed as separate. And that's sort of in a nutshell kind of encapsulate the resort, because at a resort, at a hotel, everything from the smell when you walk in to the soap in the bathroom is sort of consistent from an experience standpoint. And we kind of want to the largest extent possible that we can control within the commonly accessible spaces, we want to be able to bring that.
Very exciting. I wish that I was working there. I mean, one thing I'm sensing here, right, is this through line of like deep intentionality that you guys have in designing these products and thinking about the end user. And especially like with this project as an example, it feels to me, one, very courageous to have taken on a project like this at a time when you started taking it on, but 2, very forward thinking to think, like, we're not just going to rinse and repeat what we've done before. We need to think about who are the decision makers that are tenanting this building.
Yeah.
How are they different than the decision makers who have been looking for office space or, whatever type of space for the past few decades or generations? What do these people want, and how can we deliver that in a way that's going to add value to them and, of course, return value to our shareholders? I think it's great. It's really cool to hear, kind of this next level thinking.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's just, and there's no knock on that. We have plenty of colleagues and friends in the industry, and again, not every building can sort of adopt this approach. Like, it'd be crazy to think that you can invest, this much, this level of capital and intentionality into every single office building, because it just doesn't work, right? And so you just got to be very sort of intentional about even that piece of it as well. And like I said, we're looking at obviously the other opportunities in the market. And yes, while we do want to change the way things look and feel, it's gonna be a very different level depending on what type of asset we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, very cool. Well, hey, I think this might be a great time to move to the lightning round of
Yeah,
our conversation. This is something that I like to do with our guests, just quick
yeah.
questions, hopefully quick answers. And I think this is geared more towards, kind of the students in our cohort who, I think have a lot to gain from hearing the insights and the learnings that people like you, Kabir,
hmm
have experienced along the way. So, first question, if you could change any one policy at the federal, state, or local level, what would it be and why?
I would say state and local because I don't know to what extent how to necessarily address this issue at large, but certainly at the state and local level, like I am still every day blown away at how relatively ineffective and slow moving legislation has been in terms of encouraging housing production. Like, and let's just take the office to residential conversion. Like, you don't need to be a developer or a rocket scientist to know that it's pretty expensive to do this. So if housing is really a need and office is at an all-time high in terms of vacancy, like for God's sake, like just come up with some sort of creative incentives, tax breaks, whatever it is to make these things happen rather than go the opposite direction like we're doing in San Francisco where people are still talking about introducing like, you know, all electric sort of ordinances for conversions and significant construction. It's like, can we just for like 5 years, just pause, break. Let's just get this train moving in terms of housing production and make it easier for, forget us, but just make it easier for like anybody to sort of like convert a 10,000 square foot office building into lofts or whatever it is. Like it's just so impossible right now. And I just don't know why it's taken so long to get to this point.
Yeah, it's a good one. Removing red tape, I feel like, is always a great one there. And it's funny,
Yeah.
coming from DC, they just implemented not too long ago a 20-year tax abatement
Yeah.
for what they're calling office to anything
Yeah.
conversion, right? And
Yeah.
it's like,
I forget the developer's name. There's a developer out there. You probably know the name that's done a lot of that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, DC, I think is, if not the
Yeah.
second, then the third next to New York as leading the way in office to residential conversion these days. So
Yeah, New York's been doing the property tax abatement thing for decades, and
yeah,
that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's like, what? Why is it so hard for us to kind of figure out that, adhere, and do that?
completely agree. All right, next question. What's one book, podcast, or person you're listening to lately that's inspired you in either design, business, real estate, or the like?
Hmm. I do read a heck of a lot, and so it's very always tough to point one thing. It's going to sound really strange, but been listening to like things like Diary of a CEO. My wife's really into it, so she got me into that, which is really great from like just a general exposure standpoint. But really, what's been very helpful, I think, from a business standpoint, particularly as of late, is just it's quite frankly just a lot of podcasts and books on just the notions of like mindfulness and presence. Like it's just been very, very, I think, effective as the organization Presidio Bay has grown. As you know, times are changing. As there's a lot of volatility in the world, like it's been a very helpful thing. As you know, we settle now into our like second decade of running the company. Feels very different, and I think just a different approach than when we were basically running on the rocket fuel of our 20s to get to this point. And so that sounds like a little bit of a sort of vague answer, but that's truly that kind of where I am at this moment right now in terms of like that's what I'm focused on. Like I said, oddly enough, to actually help with the business more and more.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny, stuff like that, mindfulness can feel like a luxury at times, I'm sure, to
Yeah,
someone who's starting and running a very successful business, but it's refreshing to hear a
yeah.
COO of a successful development firm give an answer like that. So I appreciate it. What's the best piece of career advice you've ever been given?
Well, I didn't listen to it for many years, but patience and relationships, and by that I mean I was very impatient, and I also like obviously very social and building relationships, but I never really like sort of combined the two and two together to like really appreciate how relationships plus time equals things you could never even have thought possible. So for me, I think just combining those two, like I don't know if it's or right or wrong, but like we're obviously, and particularly in the Bay Area, things are changing so quickly. It's there's certainly an element of like how it's not a bad thing if you're sort of changing careers like every couple of years, you're going from like company to company. Um, but now that I've been doing this for coming up on over 12 years now, yes, I've been doing the same thing for 12 years, but it's been like a different thing every year. So I think it's just again a matter of perspective, right? And sometimes patience and sort of building on one thing over long periods of time is really how meaningful sort of things happen in your life. And my wife's also an entrepreneur, and she started a company a couple of years ago, and she was like, "It really took you guys like 10 years to like really build a company." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's pretty much how it goes." Like things take like a while, and you get sort of used to like the quick wins and the headlines, especially you see here, like company goes from 0 to 1 billion in 2 years. Like, sure, that happens, but that's like the tail end. That's like that's like the sort of like the abnormal case of success, I think, for the most part.
Yeah, feels like a good metaphor for real estate development in general.
Yeah, 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 especially in the Bay Area.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, I feel like for a podcast that's about teaching the next generation of real estate developers, that feels like quite a good place to end it, actually. So maybe we'll wrap up here. Kabir, this has been a lot of fun. Before we sign off, do you have any parting words for the audience, or how can our listeners follow you and Presidio Bay and what you guys are up to?
Yeah, we're pretty active on social, so LinkedIn, Instagram. Feel free to give Presidio Bay a follow. You can reach out to me anytime. Kabir at PresidioBay.com. Happy to chat with anybody about what you're thinking. Yeah, I'm super excited, and thanks for having me on this podcast. It's really cool to see, I think, just access to different perspectives that you're bringing to the students. And yeah, I was looking forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time. Keep tuning in this season for more interesting conversations with professionals like Kabir. I'm Robbie Mulcahy. We'll see you next time here at the MIT Center for Real Estate.
Thanks to our listeners for tuning into another edition of Meet the Visionaries podcast. And please remember to stay tuned for future episodes by subscribing to our podcast, or follow us on social media by visiting cre.mit.edu to learn more. Until next time, take care, listeners.